In 1890, the United States completed one of the most important operations in its history, a full national census that recorded over 63 million people across cities, farms, railroads, and remote settlements, every name, every age, every occupation written down in ink as part of what was meant to become the permanent memory of a growing nation, a system so critical that representation in Congress, taxation, and infrastructure planning all depended on it, making the census not just a record, but the foundation of how the country functioned. And by that time, the process had already evolved into one of the largest and most advanced data operations of the 19th century, using mechanical tabulation machines and thousands of workers to process information with a level of organization and control that made the idea of total loss almost impossible. This was not fragile, it was not temporary, it was structured, documented and protected. And yet today, almost all of those records are gone, not partially lost, not slowly degraded over time, but erased. Nearly the entire 1890 census missing from history, leaving behind a gap so large that historians still struggle to fully reconstruct what was once clearly recorded. And what makes this even more unsettling is that this was not ancient history, not a forgotten archive from centuries ago, but something that happened inside a modern government system with storage, protocols and responsibility, which leads to a question that sounds simple, but becomes more disturbing the longer you think about it. How do you lose an entire population on paper? To understand how this could happen, you have to understand what the census truly meant at that time, because it wasn't optional, it wasn't symbolic, it was the structural backbone of the country itself, determining political power, economic planning, and the distribution of resources, meaning the data collected in 1890 was among the most valuable information the government possessed, carefully stored, archived, and expected to be preserved for generations. Or at least that was the assumption, until decades later, when something happened that would change the historical record forever. Decades after the census was completed, the records were still stored inside a government building in Washington, D.C., preserved as part of the official archive of the nation, expected to remain there for generations, untouched and secure, until in 1921 something happened that would quietly change the historical record forever. A fire broke out inside the Commerce Department building, the place where the original 1890 census records were kept, and at first, the explanation seemed simple, almost routine for that time. The fire caused damage, water from firefighting efforts flooded the rooms, documents were soaked, some burned, others declared beyond recovery. A familiar story in an era when fire was a constant threat and archives were far more vulnerable than they are today. But the deeper you look into what happened inside that building, the less convincing that explanation becomes. Because the records were not completely destroyed. In fact, a significant portion of the census still existed after the fire. Damaged, yes, but not gone, not reduced to ash, not erased completely, but physically present, recoverable, still there. Workers at the time reportedly moved through the building, stepping over wet floors and scattered papers, collecting what remained, lifting documents from the ground, inspecting them, separating what could be saved from what was too far gone. And early reports suggested that at least part of the archive could have been preserved, which raises a question that is far more difficult to ignore. If the records survived, why didn't they survive history? After the fire, when people were finally able to move through the building again, it became clear that the records were not completely destroyed. Many of them were still there, damaged but intact, soaked with water, edges burned, pages stuck together, but still readable, still understandable, still physically present. Workers stepped carefully across wet floors, lifting documents one by one, laying them out, separating what could be saved from what was too far gone. And for a brief moment it seemed like the story might not end here, like the damage wasn't final, like the historical record could still be restored. But then something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, in a way that didn't look like destruction at all. It looked like routine. Decisions started being made inside offices. Documents were reviewed, categorized, and slowly redefined, first as damaged, then as unnecessary, and eventually as not worth saving. And once something is labelled that way, it becomes easy to remove, easy to justify its disappearance. Boxes of records began to leave the building. Shelves that had once been full started to open up. Space appeared where there had been none before, and what had survived the fire began to disappear anyway. Not because it was destroyed, but because it was no longer considered important enough to keep, and this process didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where everything was lost. Instead, it unfolded slowly, piece by piece, decision by decision, until what had once been one of the most complete records of an entire nation was reduced to almost nothing. For decades, almost no one questioned what happened to the 1890 census. The official explanation was simple and convenient. A fire destroyed the records and what remained was too damaged to be saved. It sounded logical, it sounded final, and for a long time people accepted it without looking deeper. But as years passed, historians began to notice something that didn't quite fit. There was a gap, a massive one. Between 1880 and 1900, two of the most important decades in American history, the detailed records were simply gone. No full census, no complete picture of the population, no clear data on how people lived, moved, worked, or changed during that time. And this wasn't just any period. It was the moment when the country was transforming faster than ever before. Cities were expanding, industries were rising, millions of immigrants were arriving, entire communities were forming, shifting, disappearing, and yet the most detailed record of that transformation had vanished. Historians tried to reconstruct what they could. They searched through fragments, partial data, local archives, personal records, anything that could help rebuild the missing picture. But it was never enough, because a census is not just numbers, it's structure, it's patterns, it's the ability to see an entire society at once, and without it something fundamental is lost. Not just information, but understanding, the ability to connect events, to see cause and effect, to understand how a nation actually changed in real time. And the deeper researchers looked into the story of the 1890 census, the more uncomfortable it became, because the problem wasn't only that the records were gone, it was the way they disappeared. Not all at once, not completely in the fire, but gradually, through decisions, through reclassification, through quiet removal, until what should have been preserved simply ceased to exist. By the time people began to seriously question what had happened to the 1890 census, most of the evidence was already gone. Not because it had all been destroyed in the fire, but because what survived had been slowly removed afterward, piece by piece, through decisions that at the time seemed routine, almost administrative, but in hindsight changed everything. There was no single moment where someone stood up and said the records should disappear. There was no dramatic order, no public announcement, no clear act of destruction that people could point to. Instead, it happened quietly, over years, through reviews, reclassifications and approvals, where documents that had survived were first considered damaged, then unnecessary, and eventually disposable. And once something becomes disposable inside a system, it rarely survives. Records were boxed, moved, and discarded, sometimes with justification, sometimes simply because no one argued strongly enough to keep them, and over time the result was the same, the disappearance of something that should have been permanent. What makes this story harder to ignore is not just the loss itself, but the timing. Because the 1890 census didn't disappear in isolation. It vanished during one of the most critical turning points in American history, a period of rapid industrialization, mass immigration, urban expansion, social transformation, a moment where the structure of the country was being rewritten in real time, and yet the most detailed record of that transformation is the one that no longer exists. Not fully, not completely, not in the way it should. Which leaves us with a question that historians still struggle to answer. Was it just negligence, or something more deliberate? The real problem with the loss of the 1890 census is not just that something disappeared, it's what that disappearance took with it. Because without those records, an entire layer of American history becomes harder to see, harder to measure, harder to understand, and in some cases impossible to reconstruct accurately. Families lose traceable connections, communities lose continuity, and entire patterns of movement, work, and life become fragmented. For historians, this creates a distortion, because when you remove a major data point from the middle of a timeline, everything before and after begins to lose precision, trends become harder to track, changes become harder to explain, and what should be a clear progression turns into something uncertain, something incomplete, something that can only be estimated instead of fully understood. This gap affects more than just academic research. It affects how history is written, how it is taught, and how it is remembered. Because without a full record, interpretations begin to fill the space where facts should be, and over time those interpretations can harden into accepted narratives, even if they were built on missing information. And this is where the loss becomes something more than just an accident, because when a key piece of evidence disappears, it doesn't just remove information, it reshapes understanding, it changes the way events are connected, it alters the way a society sees its own past, and once that happens, it becomes almost impossible to fully recover what was lost, not just in data, but in meaning. Today, the loss of the 1890 census is usually explained in the simplest possible way: a fire, damaged records, a bureaucratic failure, an unfortunate accident that erased part of the past, and for most people that explanation is enough. It sounds reasonable, it sounds complete, it sounds like something that belongs in the past and has no real impact on the present. But when you take a closer look, that explanation begins to fall apart, because what disappeared was not just a collection of documents, it was a detailed snapshot of a nation at a moment when everything was changing at once. This was the period when millions of people were arriving, when cities were expanding faster than they ever had before, when industries were reshaping the way people lived and worked, when entire communities were forming and disappearing in the span of a single generation, and the one system designed to capture all of that, to record it, to preserve it, to make it understandable, is the one thing that didn't survive in full. And that creates a problem that doesn't stay in the past. Because every time we try to understand that period today, we're not working with a complete picture. We're working around a void. We're filling gaps with estimates, connecting events with incomplete information, building explanations on top of something that is fundamentally missing. And over time, those explanations become accepted, they become repeated, they become taught, even though they are shaped by absence. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because the disappearance of the 1890 census was not a single event. It wasn't just the fire, it was everything that came after. The decisions, the reclassification, the slow removal of what had survived, the quiet acceptance that something important was no longer worth keeping. And that kind of process is much harder to recognize, because it doesn't look like destruction, it looks like normal. And if something this large can disappear that way, not violently, not suddenly, but gradually, through ordinary decisions, then it forces a much larger question. How much of what we believe about history is actually based on complete records, and how much is based only on what happened to survive? Because history is not just a record of events, it's a record of what was kept, what was written down, what was preserved, and what was allowed to vanish. And once you start thinking about it that way, the loss of the 1890 census stops being just a historical detail. It becomes something else entirely, not just a mistake, but a warning.